It wasn't supposed to be a big case. No national coverage, no cameras, just a quiet federal courtroom tucked into the back of the state courthouse in Dayton, Ohio. On the docket, State of Ohio versus Joseph M. Colton, a third-generation soybean and cattle farmer accused of environmental code violations and unauthorized land use. But by the time the gavel dropped, everything had changed. What started as a routine hearing about zoning laws and farm runoff had exploded into something far bigger, a symbol of the growing divide between America's rural backbone and its urban bureaucracy. The room was packed. Journalists from across the state filled the back benches. Protesters and supporters lined the courthouse steps, and at the center of it all sat an old man in boots and a worn denim jacket. Joe Colton, 69, with hands calloused by decades of work and a heart that had never seen the inside of a courtroom until now. They were trying to bury him in fines and strip his land of the grazing rights his family had used since the Great Depression. But Joe wasn't alone anymore. Because on that day, Senator J.D. Vance walked into the courtroom, not as a politician, but as Joe's legal defender. Yes, that J.D. Vance, best-selling author, Marine veteran, U.S. Senator, and Ohio native who hadn't forgotten the smell of farm soil or the sound of a pickup crunching gravel. When asked why he would represent a farmer in a minor zoning case, Vance answered simply, "Because when the system tries to silence the people who feed us, it's time somebody said no." Judge Elsbeth Durham, a stern federal appointee with a reputation for cold rulings and clipped lectures, stared across the bench as Vance adjusted the mic. "We'll begin with opening remarks," she said. "Mr. Vance, you may proceed." J.D. stood slowly, the gallery quiet as a heartbeat. He looked at the judge, then at Joe Colton, and then, without glancing at his notes, he began to speak. "Your Honor, before we debate codes and permits, let's talk about something Washington forgot a long time ago, where our food comes from, and who's still breaking their backs to grow it." The courtroom leaned in, because they didn't know it yet. But they were about to witness a defense so powerful, so unexpected, so rooted in American grit, that by the end of it, the judge would have no words left to give. J.D. Vance didn't pace. He didn't gesture wildly. He didn't speak like a politician trying to score points. He spoke like a man who had been there. "Joe Colton is not a criminal," J.D. said, voice steady. "He's a farmer, a husband, a man who wakes up at 4:30 a.m. every morning to tend soil most folks wouldn't even bother walking on." The judge adjusted her glasses but said nothing. And today, this courtroom has the audacity to accuse him of harming the very land he spent his life trying to keep alive. J.D. turned toward the jury, a mix of suburban retirees, one union worker, a college professor, and a middle-aged woman from rural Springfield. They weren't expecting to be moved today, but they were already sitting straighter. "The state says he didn't follow the approved environmental process. You know what his process is?" J.D. continued, now looking directly at the jury. "It's listening to the weather, watching the fields, rotating his crops, rebuilding soil by hand, season after season. He doesn't just know the land, he carries it in his bones." The prosecution shifted, uncomfortable. They hadn't planned on rhetoric. They had spreadsheets, satellite images, code violations. J.D. saw it and leaned in. "They want to show you drone photo book, technical charts, but they won't show you the acre Joe refused to sell when the development company offered him a 6-figure check because it held his father's ashes." You could hear a pin drop. "They won't tell you about the vet who grazes his cattle on Joe's land rent-free, or the family Joe gave food to during the 2020 lockdowns because the shelves were bare and the system didn't come." Even Judge Durham blinked, her facade cracking ever so slightly. This man didn't violate anything. He upheld something rare, something sacred. He chose the land over the ledger. Vance stepped back. "This case isn't about water samples. It's about whether we still respect the people who feed us, or whether we've decided to regulate them out of existence." Silence. The courtroom wasn't just listening. It was processing. A defense rooted in principle, not politics. A defense with dirt under its nails. The judge looked down at her papers, but for once, she didn't know what to write. The prosecution rose after J.D. Vance's opening remarks, visibly rattled. Their lead counsel, a sharp-suited man named Robert Glenn, took the floor with binders, charts, and citations in hand. "This is not about attacking agriculture," Glenn began. "It's about ensuring everyone, no matter how noble their profession, follows the law." He gestured to a printed photo of a stream running through Joe Colton's land. "We have satellite evidence that his land runoff exceeded permitted phosphorus levels. His water management didn't follow protocol. His grazing rotation wasn't properly documented." J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He crossed his arms, listened. The courtroom, however, had shifted. The people weren't leaning into the evidence. They were leaning into meaning, something J.D. had already placed on the table. The prosecution droned on, permits, violations, compliance deadlines. The human side of the story vanished behind bureaucracy. When Glenn finished, the judge nodded mechanically, then looked to J.D. "Mr. Vance, you may cross-examine." J.D. stood. "Mr. Glenn," he said, "can you tell me how many generations your family has lived in Ohio?" Glenn blinked. "I don't see how that's relevant." "It's relevant," J.D. replied, "because you're accusing a man whose family has lived on the same plot of land for 97 years without a single state subsidy of not loving that land enough." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. J.D. walked to the photo of the stream, held it up. This photo was taken by drone, not by a person who stood on that bank, smelled the air, saw the frogs, watched the deer come down to drink. Just pixels. But here's what matters. Joe Colton drinks from this stream. He turned to the jury. His grandkids do too. Another silence. What kind of fool poisons his own well? What kind of man, accused of environmental harm, keeps bees, grows cover crops, and hosts field days for local schoolchildren? He returned to his table, paused, then looked right at the judge. "You know what Joe's real crime is? He didn't hire a lobbyist. He didn't submit paperwork to 3 agencies for what his grandfather did by instinct. He just kept working, and that doesn't fit the model anymore." The judge opened her mouth, then closed it. The jury? Locked in. Not on codes, not on chemistry. On truth. And J.D. had just drawn a line in the sand between the people who live on the land and the people who manage it from a desk. The courtroom doors opened after a short recess, and the air felt different. Less like a trial, more like a reckoning. J.D. Vance stood beside Joe Colton as the elderly farmer made his way to the witness stand. He didn't walk with swagger. He walked like a man who'd spent 6 decades lifting hay bales, repairing fences, and burying dogs under the same sycamore tree. Judge Durham looked up from her bench. "Mr. Colton, do you swear to tell the truth?" "I do," Joe said, not waiting for her to finish. A few people in the gallery chuckled, the kind of laughter that comes from recognizing a man who's been honest so long he doesn't need reminding. J.D. approached slowly. "Joe," he began, "how long has your family been on that land?" "Since 1926, Joe said. "My granddad bought it with 2 mules and a handshake." "And how many times have you changed how you manage the land since then?" Joe scratched his jaw. "Every decade, give or take. Learned new ways, some worked, some didn't. Soil tells you when you're wrong." J.D. nodded. "Can you explain to the court what soil tells you means?" Joe shrugged. "Means if your land's sick, your crops whisper it. Yields drop, colour fades, worms leave. You either fix it, or the land quits on you." A long pause. "Mr. Colton," J.D. asked, "why didn't you file the paperwork the state asked for last year?" Joe took a long breath. "Because I didn't know what it was asking me for. I ain't got a lawyer on payroll. I got a barn roof to fix, and when I did call, they sent me to voicemail. Twice." A few jurors nodded slowly. J.D. turned toward the gallery. "Did you ever knowingly dump chemicals into your water supply?" Joe almost looked offended. "Why the hell would I poison the place I raise my grandkids?" J.D. smiled softly. "You wouldn't. That's the point." He turned back to the bench. "No further questions." The judge blinked. The prosecution declined to cross-examine. Because what could they say? Joe had already answered the only question that mattered, not with metrics but with integrity. And once again, J.D. Vance hadn't needed to win the room. He'd simply reminded them what truth looks like in work boots and a flannel shirt. The courtroom settled into a kind of reverent stillness, not boredom, respect. Joe Colton had spoken like a man with nothing to prove and nothing to hide. His honesty wasn't performative, it was lived. And J.D. Vance had given that truth a megaphone. Now it was the state's turn to salvage what was left of their case. The prosecution called its final witness, Dr. Miriam Blanche, an environmental policy expert with 3 degrees and a stack of glossy charts. She stepped into the courtroom in a tailored suit, laptop in hand, and the quiet air of someone used to being listened to. "We're not here to vilify farmers," she said, looking directly at the jury. "But our records show Mr. Colton exceeded nitrogen runoff thresholds by 14%. That affects groundwater, surrounding ecosystems, and state compliance with federal guidelines." She tapped on her laptop and a graph appeared on the monitor beside the jury box. Lines, arrows, data. "We must enforce regulations fairly, regardless of intention," she continued. "A single violation can affect communities miles downstream." Her voice was calm, polished, technocratic. But the courtroom, especially the jury, was drifting. Because while Dr. Blanche talked in variables, Joe Colton talked in values. When JD stood for cross-examination, he didn't touch the laptop. He didn't touch the graph. He walked right up and asked one question. "Dr. Blanche, have you ever met Joe Colton before today?" She hesitated. "No." "Have you ever set foot on his farm?" "No." "Have you ever drunk water from the stream he's accused of polluting?" Another pause. "No, but have you ever driven a tractor?" She blinked. "No." JD turned to the jury. "So we have a woman who's never touched the land in question telling us more about it than the man who spent his entire life caring for it." Objection. Overruled. "Dr. Blanche," JD asked, "do you believe data tells the whole story?" She shifted. "Data is the most objective measure we have. Then tell me, what does your graph say about the day Joe Colton paid for his neighbor's seed after her crops failed?" Silence. "What does it say about the homeless vet who sleeps in Joe's hayloft when the shelters are full?" Silence again. JD stepped back. "Data can tell you what's wrong with a field, but only a man can tell you why he stayed anyway." That line hit hard. Even the judge's clerk stopped typing for a moment. JD closed his folder, tapped it gently. No further questions. And just like that, the state's credibility crumbled. Not because their numbers were wrong, but because they forgot the land wasn't just soil, it was soul. And J.D. Vance had just reminded everyone. Judge Elsbeth Durham sat stiff-backed behind the bench. Her reputation had been built on precision and control, but today she was watching the ground shift beneath her feet. The prosecution's case, once wrapped in policies and codes, now looked cold, clinical, detached. J.D. Vance had introduced something they didn't prepare for, humanity, and it was winning. With the state resting its case, Judge Durham turned to the defense. "Senator Vance, you may deliver your closing remarks." J.D. stood. No papers, no podium, no theatrics, just presence. He stepped into the open space between the jury and the bench, and paused. "Colton, we find the defendant not guilty." The room went silent, a hush so thick it felt like the air had solidified. Then, without warning, the applause erupted. It wasn't just the handful of supporters now standing, clapping. It was the whole room. Even some of the reporters were clapping. The weight of the moment, the truth that had just been delivered, swept through the room like a flood, washing away the formalities and the years of red tape that had almost buried Joe Colton's legacy. The judge, her face unreadable, stood and slammed the gavel. "This court is adjourned." But it didn't feel like an end. It felt like a beginning. A beginning for Joe Colton, who had just been exonerated, but also for every person in that room who had heard the truth spoken so plainly, so powerfully, that it couldn't help but shift something inside them. Something in the system had been broken wide open. We need a new way of thinking. And with that, he walked away, not looking for applause, but knowing that something had changed. The trial, once thought to be about codes and violations, had become a reckoning, and the country had taken notice. It wasn't just Joe Colton's victory. It was the victory of a movement that recognized the worth of the land, the people who worked it, and the truth that had been buried beneath bureaucracy for far too long. The system had blinked, and America had spoken. We need to remember who we're working for. Meanwhile, Joe Colton returned to his farm. The morning after the trial, he was back on his tractor before dawn. Neighbors brought pie. A local Boy Scout troop showed up with handmade signs. "Thanks for fighting for farms." Joe said little, but one moment stood out. A group of ag students from Ohio State arrived and asked if he'd speak to their class sometime. He hesitated. "I'm no teacher," he muttered. But one of them replied, "You taught the whole country something last week." That stopped Joe in his tracks. And back in Washington, as committee rooms resumed their rituals and policy meetings resumed as usual, One thing was different. There was a name they couldn't stop hearing. Not a lobbyist, not a CEO, a farmer. Joe Colton. Because J.D. Vance hadn't just defended one man, he had reminded America what it owed to millions like him. Months passed. The cameras moved on. The networks found new headlines. But in the heartland, where the wind still rolled over wheat and the fields still sang in rows, Joe Colton's story never left. In Iowa, a judge referenced the case before ruling in favor of a small dairy farm facing similar zoning threats. In Georgia, lawmakers drafted a new bill nicknamed the Colton Clause, requiring agricultural knowledge in any rural land use regulatory review. And in Ohio, a mural appeared on the side of a grain elevator just outside of Dayton. It wasn't flashy, just an image of J.D. Vance helping Joe Colton down the courthouse steps. No words, just boots, flannel, and a quiet victory. But the story didn't belong to those two men anymore. It belonged to every forgotten American who'd ever been told they didn't matter unless they complied. To every farmer who knew more about soil than statutes. To every family who lost land not because they broke the law, but because the law broke them. One evening, J.D. Vance was asked to speak at a university lecture on rural rights and the future of federalism. He wore no tie, spoke for only 12 minutes, and near the end someone asked him, "Senator, what would you say to the people who still believe that Joe Colton's win was a one-time fluke?" J.D. paused, then answered quietly, "I'd tell them a fluke doesn't echo in cornfields, and this one's still echoing." He closed his notes, walked off stage. And somewhere far from the marble of Washington, deep in the quiet heart of Ohio, Joe Colton sat on his porch, dog at his feet, watching dusk settle across the hills. A reporter once asked him what he learned from the trial. Joe looked out at the barn, the hayfield, the old fence his father had built. Then he said, "Learned the land can't speak for itself, but sometimes if you're lucky, it gets a voice." And thanks to J.D. Vance, it finally did.